Well, yesterday was Christmas, and it won't be long till New Year's will be here. This time next year it'll be 2022. This time next week it'll be next year. It'll be 2022. And one of the things that's associated with New Year's is toasting the new year and parties at which alcohol is served. And that seems to be the case throughout the holiday season. And we had talked about this briefly a while back, and I thought it would be interesting today to sort of take a breather and look at the use of alcoholic beverages in Christianity from the perspective of the Bible and society. Now, surprisingly enough, up until the 1800s, drinking alcohol had never been an issue within Christianity. It was not thought to be a Christian issue and was not thought in any way to be at odds with being a Christian. And the reason for that is simple. The Bible talks about alcohol many times in a positive light. For example, from Psalm 104 we hear, God causes the grass to grow for the cattle, vegetation for the service of man, that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine that makes the heart glad. And see, there are other biblical passages that talk about wine in a positive light, about how it makes the heart glad and merry. In the Old Testament, wine was seen to be a gift from God. Flourishing vineyards were seen to be a sign of God's blessing. In Jeremiah chapter 31, God is talking about how one day he will restore the land and the people. And it says, I will build you and you will be rebuilt. You will take up your tambourines and go forth to the dances of the merrymakers. And you will plant vineyards on the hills of Samaria. The planters will plant them and will enjoy them. And so this theme occurs a number of times throughout the Old Testament. Flourishing vineyards are a sign of God's blessing. And with the fruit of those vineyards, you make the heart merry. And moving on into the New Testament, you remember the first miracle recorded Jesus ever did was turn water into wine. And if you look at the size of the jars, they say that he turned into wine, they were not little things like that, they were like that. They would hold like 30 gallons. So Jesus made like 60 or 90 gallons of wine. Now the Gospels indicate that Jesus himself drank wine, and in one passage he is even accused to drinking to excess. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus is talking about John the Baptist, and it says that the tax collectors heard John the Baptist's message and were baptized, but the Pharisees and the Jewish officials wouldn't pay him any attention. And then Jesus said this, for John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you said he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So the Jewish leaders were apparently saying that Jesus drank too much. But at any rate, drinking alcohol is accepted in the Bible. Obviously, people just drank, and it's considered to be a gift from God that adds to the enjoyment of life. However, the Bible does condemn drunkenness. In Galatians chapter 5, among the things that it lists that says will cause you not to go to heaven, drunkenness is on that list. And there are other places in the Bible that also condemn drunkenness. So from the Bible we see that alcohol use is accepted, but drunkenness is condemned. And that's why drinking alcohol was always accepted in Christianity. It wasn't considered an issue. Drunkenness was an issue, but not drinking. It was seen as a normal part of life, not in any way being at odds with being a Christian. Interestingly enough, the Puritans who first came here in the 1620s were known for their somber and austere lifestyle, but alcohol was a part of Puritan life. They reportedly carried enough beer with them on the way on the Mayflower so that each person could drink 4 liters a day. That's like 2 of those Diet Cokes, you know. And one of the things that they built when they first got here was a brewery. Now, later as this country began to be settled by other people, breweries and stills and making liquor was very common. Church members reportedly tithed what they made in their stills to the church. And that practice actually comes from the Old Testament, where it tells people to tithe their wine. The salaries of many preachers in colonial early America included a whiskey allowance. Preachers in frontier areas of the United States often operated stills to supplement their income. Not long ago, I was reading about the history of Cleveland County, and it talked about a couple of preachers in this area back in the 1700s who were known to preach on Sunday morning and work at their stills on Sunday afternoon. And that back then was not considered in any way to be abnormal. But a little over 200 years ago, the views of some Christians about alcohol began to change. The idea that alcohol is sinful apparently came from a man named John Wesley. And John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist, Pentecostal, and Holiness denominations that exist today. And he began to develop ambivalent attitudes toward alcohol. At first he said you can't drink liquor, but beer and wine are okay. And then he decided that it was all bad. In 1780, the General Conference of the Methodist Church in the United States condemned the production and sale of liquor. Beer was still all right, but you were supposed to stay away from liquor. However, a short time later, the Methodists extended their prohibition to include all kinds of alcoholic beverages. And so John Wesley, who was the father of what are called the Holiness denominations, developed the idea that holiness in life was not compatible with drinking alcohol. Now, at about this time, outside of Christianity in the secular world, something very important was happening. The Industrial Revolution was beginning. And that started in the latter part of the 1700s, and the United States underwent a drastic change. It changed from being primarily a rural agricultural nation to being an urban manufacturing nation. People moved from rural areas into the cities, and they moved from the farms to the factories. The population of the United States became concentrated in cities where people lived all packed together. And you know, when people live all packed together, what everybody does is open to display for everybody else. And you can't do anything without other people seeing you and without it affecting other people. You know, you think about earlier in frontier life in the United States when everybody lived on farms and they lived out there by themselves, and you probably never knew what the people, you know, that lived on down from you did. You couldn't see them, you couldn't hear what they were doing. You might have seen them once or twice a week, but whatever they did in their personal life, you didn't know. And you didn't know what you did either. But when everybody started living in cities, what everybody did was seen by everybody, and what everybody did affected other people. And this was the time when societal ills and the problems of society began being talked about. People living crowded together in cities created a lot of problems. And people noticed that drinking alcohol seemed to be the cause of a lot of those problems. And it was at this time that something called the American Temperance Society was formed. It was formed in 1826, and it spread rapidly. It soon attracted over 1 million members, and that was significant because the entire population of the United States at that time was only 9 million. The temperance movement advocated moderation in the use of alcohol, if they could convince people to be more moderate in their drinking, they thought that they could calm down some of the problems of society. And then along came the Civil War. And at the time of the Civil War, people had other things on their mind than whether or not their neighbor drank too much. So the temperance movement sort of subsided during the Civil War. But then, after the Civil War, as the process of recovery and rebuilding started, things started booming in the cities. Waves of people crowded into urban areas. Large numbers of immigrants began coming to the United States, and they started coming from different areas than what the immigrants had come from earlier. This time they started coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and those were areas of the world where heavy alcohol use was very common. And so you have many of the people already in the United States flocking to the cities and the urban areas, and you have new arrivals into the United States that are coming from societies where heavy alcohol use is common, and they are crowding into the cities, and alcohol once again started to be seen as a cause of societal problems. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed. And unlike the old Women's Temperance Union, this one advocated abstinence from alcohol. It said that the use of alcohol was a sin. By the year 1890, the Women's Christian Temperance Union had become the largest women's organization in the entire world. And it was composed mainly of women from Protestant denominations. It was involved with a variety of societal issues, like things like sanitation, prostitution, international peace, labor relations, education, and eventually voting rights for women. But one of the main things they did, and what really stands out, is they started a campaign to stamp out alcohol in the United States. It's difficult to overestimate the influence they had. They convinced a large portion of American society that alcohol was a major cause of social problems and that alcohol should be removed from American society. And we know they were successful. They got prohibition passed. They got it passed to where alcohol was officially outlawed throughout the entire United States. Of course, that didn't last long, but they did get it passed. So they did form a social movement that convinced people that alcohol use was bad. And these women took their newfound opposition to alcohol into their churches. And the churches picked the issue up. Now remember, the Methodists had first come up with the idea that alcohol use was bad back during the early days of the Industrial Revolution, but few outside of the Methodist denominations paid it any attention. It was only after the Civil War, when the Women's Christian Temperance Union picked it up, that it gained steam, and it gained steam throughout society. And Protestant denominations, always follow society. We've seen that 10 million times in here. And so they picked it up and began to say that use of alcohol is a sin. Now here's an interesting little tidbit. We talked about the Methodists had decided way back, years and years and years back, that drinking alcohol was a sin. But now you had communion. And traditionally, people had used wine at communion. And here they were saying that it was a sin, that they had nothing else to use. And so in 1869, a Methodist preacher named Thomas Welch developed a process for pasteurizing grape juice so you could preserve plain grape juice for use in communion. And that was the beginning of Welch's grape juice. It was a Methodist minister trying to find a way to preserve grape juice so you could use grape juice instead of wine for communion. Little by little, the American Protestant denominations began to see alcohol use as a sin. In 1896, the largest American denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, declared Alcohol used to be a sin. Already seen how the Methodists had done that a long time ago. Others followed suit, like the Presbyterian. And this was a huge change in Christianity. After 1,800 years of being seen as a non-issue, all of a sudden alcohol use was being seen as a horrendous sin. And, you know, people sit down and think, well, we've got to have more to go on than just us following society. We've got to make the Bible say it's a sin. But you see, they faced a big problem. The Bible nowhere says that. In fact, the Bible praises it. And how can you all of a sudden decide something's a sin when it's praised throughout the Bible? How can you say drinking is a sin when Jesus himself drank? And this created a real problem. But you know, we've seen all along in here a million times before, it's never a problem when organized Christianity wants to follow society, they'll find a way. And the first way they came up with was to say that the Bible really doesn't talk about wine. It never talks about wine. When it talks about wine, it's just talking about grape juice. All those places in the Bible when it talks about wine, it wasn't fermented. It didn't have any alcohol in it altogether. It was just grape juice. But that position was harder and harder to defend. You know, if you think about it, there was no way back then to preserve anything. There were no chemical preservatives. There was no way to freeze it. There was no way like to make frozen concentrate like you could buy at the grocery store. Grape juice on its own, even if you do nothing to it, will start to ferment on its own in just a day or so and begin to produce alcohol. And if you consider the fact that grapes don't bear but a few weeks a year, it wouldn't even be worth your trouble, you know. So if that had been the case, people never would have used it. Now the idea that it was only grape juice didn't really solve anything, it didn't really make sense, but it was promoted. And even today, I hear some people occasionally say that, no, it wasn't wine, it was just grape juice. Some people still believe that. You know, like I've said in here before, it doesn't have to be true for people to believe it. It just has to be repeated enough, and it becomes true. But many people eventually realize that the position that the Bible's not talking about wine can't be defended. And they came up with another idea. They said, yes, it was really wine, but they only drank it because they had to. You know, because back in biblical times, they didn't have the city of Shelby water treatment plant over here. And so they didn't have purified, treated water. And if they went out and just drank water, well, you know, anybody would get sick with all kinds of bacterial infections and parasites and all. It would kill you. So they had to drink wine because the water was so polluted and impure they couldn't drink the water. They really didn't want to, and they didn't like to, but it was a matter of survival. That idea itself, though, had problems. There are all kinds of references in the Bible, Old and New Testament, to people going to wells and getting water. So the Bible indicates that people did use water. But there's an even more difficult problem with this one. If all you had to drink was wine, you just think now, I don't know what the recommended water intake of things is today, but it's a lot. It's like more than really you should drink of wine. If you were trying to get all of your liquid intake for the day in wine, you'd be pretty tipsy all day. And think of your children. I mean, you know, your 4-year-old would be running around drunk all day, going out the bottle with wine in it. So, you know, it was really indefensible, some of these things people came up with. But I still hear these arguments presented today. There was one passage in the Bible they could point to. One. It comes from Proverbs. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging. Now, it's really hard to see that as a biblical injunction against drinking, but if that's all you have to run with it. But people really did have a hard time making a biblical argument that drinking alcohol is a sin. You can make a biblical argument against drunkenness, but you cannot really make a biblical argument against drinking alcohol. So, when we look at the idea that drinking alcohol is a sin, we see that it was something that got borrowed from a social movement that started within the Methodist Church, and then that really got picked up, though, after the Civil War, as women began on a crusade to help some of society's ills. It never was a religious-based thing. I think it's important to know two things about this. This was basically an American thing. Movements against drinking got started in Europe, but they never went anywhere. And in the United States, the movement against alcohol and Christianity affected Protestants mainly. Denominations like Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterians. It never really made that much headway among Catholics, Lutherans, and Episcopalians. And the reason for that was simple. Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterian denominations in the United States were self-contained, independent denominations. Catholics, Lutherans, and Episcopalians were connected to mother denominations in Europe. And so those denominations did not have at their tops the attitudes of anti-alcohol. These other denominations, like Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians at that time, were truly American denominations. And they were free to tinker with biblical interpretation to fit things current in American society, while the other groups could not. The other groups were extensions of European denominations, and they couldn't tinker to make things current with American society. And the result of all this is, while the anti-alcohol movement was strong enough to get past prohibition passed, it didn't last long, anti-alcohol sentiment, though, survived. And it survived a lot mainly in the southern United States, where Methodists and Baptists predominate, and where there were fewer Catholics and Lutherans. Now, as the years went on, the tide of public opinion changed, and groups like the Methodists and Presbyterians changed their position on it and decided once again that moderate drinking is not inconsistent with the Christian lifestyle. And even among Southern Baptists, recent surveys indicate that over half of Southern Baptists themselves drink, and I would probably say it's closer, way more than that. It's just that some of them won't admit it on a survey. And so we've seen how drinking alcohol is something that is not really addressed in the Bible as a sin. It's actually praised in the Bible and said it's good. The idea that it is a sin derived from a social movement in the United States that was popular for a very short time, and it's waned out now to where there are fewer and fewer people now against it. There is only, we live in Bellwood, and we live, I think, in the only municipality in Cleveland County that is still dry. Everybody else is wet, including Boiling Springs, which is the home of Gardner-Webb University, and I had heard the opinion expressed 25, 30 years ago when I owned a business in Boiling Springs that because Gardner-Webb was over there, the Baptists never would allow beer and wine in Boiling Springs. Well, it's there now. It's even in Kaiser, but not in Bellwood. So we're crusading for righteousness up in Bellwood. So, but anyway, it was came out of a societal movement rather than a biblical movement. And I think that this is an illustration to us, again, as I said, we've seen this so many times, how organized Christianity always follows what's current in society. And yet when society, through the American Christian Women's Temperance Union, said that drinking was a sin, those women took that into their churches, and when society picked up on it, those churches decided drinking was a sin. They changed to follow society. On later into the 1900s, when that movement left society and drinking no longer was seen as a sin in society, those denominations change yet again. And so we see them move whichever way society moves back and forth. Just let society go there, and the denominations will follow. It's a classic example. Now, in the end, what we can say about alcohol use is that the Bible not only accepts it and doesn't condemn it, but sees it as a gift from God. The Bible, though, does warn against drunkenness. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't define what drunkenness consists of. So, I don't know how you decide. I guess you can decide on your own what drunkenness consists of.